Welcome back to Interconnected. I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai, and I'm excited to share another episode with you as we continue to be astounded by the microbiome. This time, our series follows our gut to the brain and reveals how your gut and brain communicate on many levels from birth to adulthood, back and forth. Science is now telling us we can improve the brain by focusing on our mind-altering microbiome. We'll explore this communication between our mind and gut and what part it plays in our well-being. There's now strong scientific evidence that our gut affects our memory, mood, and behavior, all promising a better understanding of many neurological diseases from autism to Alzheimer's. There's an old saying, it's all in the mind, is changing to it's all in the gut.
There's a huge link now between the gut and the brain and the way we interact. It's what we call the gut-brain axis, and when we talk about the gut-brain axis, I think it's important to clarify what do we mean. We mean that there are communication pathways between our gut and our brain, and it works both ways. Now, science in this area is in its early infancy, okay? We're learning more all the time, but so far we know that one route that we can exchange information, both from our brain to our gut, but also back from our gut to our brain, is the vagus nerve. One of the longest nerves in the body. It winds its way down from the brainstem, all the way down to our guts. And just as if you can feel nervous because you're under some emotional stress, that can send a message down to your gut, and you can start to have, the urge to go to the toilet. We intuitively know that kind of fear, that sort of emotional stress can impact our guts. We now know that if our gut is being nourished appropriately, we can send the right message back to our brain saying, hey, I'm not under attack. I'm not in danger. Everything's okay. When you feed your gut with the right foods, okay, when you feed those gut bugs with the right foods, okay, they make things called short-chain fatty acids. A prime example is something called butyrate. And we now know that butyrate can go to the vagus nerve, and it's a little bit like Morse code, okay? It doesn't go up the vagus nerve to your brain. It almost like just sends a signal at the bottom, and the signal changes in your brain. It's incredible. It's a bit like being downstairs in your house and pressing a light switch and a flash goes on up in your brain. It's absolutely incredible. But that butyrate can also go around the body into through your bloodstream up to your brain. It can also go in the lymphatic system and end up in your brain. So we're learning all the time. So in real life, when I see patients, and I see many patients with anxiety, I see many patients with mental health problems, I know that when I start giving them a very colorful diet, I take out the foods that are harming them, I put in the foods that, frankly, the gut bugs need. And what are these foods? These are really, it's basically fruit and vegetables that are colorful, right? This is fiber. Plant-based fiber is what nourishes our gut microbiome. And I see that when I do that, many times, people's anxiety goes down, their mood goes up.
Step one is to actually document where you are today. And that can be a tricky exercise, but I want people to get very honest with how many cups of coffee are you drinking in a day? How many cocktails are you having in a day? How much money are you spending on anti-anxiety, antidepressants, therapists, cigarettes, anonymous sex, online shopping? What is stress actually costing you, both in time, energy, and money? And the average American right now spends $11,800 per year handling stress. That's therapy, cigarettes, alcohol, coffee, anti-anxiety, antidepressants, sleeping pills. $11,800 per year we're spending on things that ultimately are masking the symptoms but not treating the root cause.
I'm a recovering type A, so I was overachieving. And I ended up in my third year of university in a very deep depression, and I was riddled with anxiety. Still had the eating disorder that was going on as well. The problem was I didn't really understand what I was going through because I'd never experienced depression before. Nobody in my family had spoken about it, so it was really hard for me to understand what was going on. And the really interesting thing about all of this is a year prior to the eating disorder starting in high school, I did a year of antibiotics for acne. And nobody made the connection between the relationship between the gut and the brain until 20 years later. So the really, really interesting thing was I was prescribed medication, SSRI medications to deal with the depression and anxiety. And 3 months after taking that, I spun into a full-blown delusional psychotic event and was then, it took 6 people to wrestle me into a straitjacket. And off I went to the rubber room at the psych ward, and I was then diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1. And I really hadn't digested the first diagnosis of depression and anxiety yet. And then I now have this other big stigma label to process, and I didn't process it very well. All I did was stuff that into a corner where I dare not to look and continue to overachieve and strive and sort of pursue success. So I was very good at that, and I ended up graduating as a valedictorian, and then I went on to working in the financial industry, reported to a CEO by the time I was 6 years into my career. And the problem was I was wearing the mask every single day that I'm okay on the outside, but I really wasn't on the inside. And in 1994, I had a suicide attempt that left me in a coma with kidney failure on dialysis, and I was told I would need a kidney transplant. And it was really at that point that I refer to my life turning around, because when you're at the bottom and you really have nowhere else to go except for taking a look at, okay, there's got to be a different road other than the pharmaceutical road that I was on. And at that point, I was on 5 psychotropic medications. So through this whole journey, I ended up learning about a nutritionally oriented psychiatrist named Dr. Abraham Hoffer. I went to see him, started on some supplements, and felt better. For the first time in a long time, I felt free of anxiety and depression.
Do you have any examples of jumping in to resolve gut microbiome issues with behavioral issues, whether in children or even adults?
I saw someone in a clinic 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, a 12-year-old girl who's been struggling for years. She's a bit of a problem child at school. That's what the teachers think. Parents come in and say, look, can you do anything? Because, we've tried everything. And you look at the diets, and it's horrific. It's a typical diet that a child or a teenager in the West would be consuming. And it's amazing that when you start, it's the same approach. What are they consuming that is harming the gut? What are they not consuming that would be beneficial? Once you start altering that, the behavior starts to improve. And I have had some kids with behavioral problems that when we actually calm things down in their gut, and again, sometimes I'm not measuring, I'm not doing a stool test to look at their gut bugs, so I'm making a clinical observation. I find that when they feed their children in a way that nourishes their gut microbes, their behavior improves. Now, I can't prove to you that that's the gut microbiome, but I can look at the science, and I know that the diet is changing the gut microbiome, and I know that when that happens, positive messages are being sent up to the brain. So I absolutely feel that that is the reason why these kids, why these adults are getting an improvement. Now, sometimes it's not enough, so you have to do other things as well. But my clinical observations by doing this fits with some very current modern science.
Chronic inflammation in the gut actually can affect chronic inflammation in the brain. And it's thought that part of that has to do with the connection of the vagus nerve to the brain. And so the vagus nerve is this nerve that basically comes from the brainstem and basically has nerve endings all through the digestive tract that are sensing what's going on. So if basically it's picking up that there is some chronic inflammation, that can actually influence what's going on in the brain. And we do know that a lot of these neurological conditions, depression, anxiety, neurodegenerative diseases, have a neuroinflammatory component. And so that's one of the key routes in which the microbiome can influence that gut-brain connection.
My story is about my children, but in particular my eldest daughter, and she had a number of different challenges after she was born, and developmentally we saw delays in her over time, and started to ask questions about it, and it came out more in her gross motor skills and her speech. She wasn't speaking at the right age, and we started to ask lots of questions. When we didn't get the answers we wanted, which were, not enough information, not enough solutions to help her on her journey, our only options at the time were speech and occupational therapy, which were helpful, but they weren't really getting to the heart of the problems, and she wasn't making a lot of progress with those things alone. So I started to dig further. And we had at the time finally gotten a diagnosis of dyspraxia, which is a gross motor coordination disorder. After we found out her diagnosis, there wasn't really any clues to it being connected to the gut or the microbiome in any way. And without doing a lot of Googling, which Dr. Google was very handy for me initially in terms of finding the connection to the microbiome. This was a while ago, so this was when I was doing this research, it's about 14 years ago, and because of that, there wasn't as much as we're seeing today. Now, if you do that same search, you're going to see a whole heck of a lot more of science that's just waiting there for you to read. But back then, there was only one book that I could find at the time that I started with, and that was The Gut and Psychology Syndrome. And that talked about how the microbiome was the starting point. And as soon as I read that book and also then looked at my medical history with the birth of my daughter, I could put the pieces together of how the microbiome was integral to what was happening to her at that time.
The prophylactic administration of antibiotics to the mother just before delivery, the 3 to 5 courses of antibiotics that infants to the age of 3 are receiving, that has probably the biggest impact, I think, on the whole future development of the microbiome and health, brain health and body health.
The fact that she was a C-section baby was probably ground zero for why she was having a disruption in her flora, because she didn't have a natural birth where you get the flora from the mother. And then over the years, we've also added in things like comprehensive stool analysis and more functional medicine things, and that's when we've started to see the needle moving a lot faster, a lot further, because we started to get at the root causes as opposed to just the symptoms and the diagnosis.
Any physician would say, okay, let's stop this. There's a taboo for antibiotics in the first 3 years of life. That has surprisingly not happened.
Once we figured all of this out and started to address the microbiome as being one of the main underlying root causes of what was going on with her, we ventured out into a particular diet, as well as we've done other things where we're reintroducing good bacteria into the gut and trying to rebalance the gut. And what we started to see was pretty obvious that this was a big part of what was going on with her. She was able to get the nutrients she needed. Her immune system rebounded. Her sensory issues started to deplete, and the therapies that we were doing from a neuro rehab perspective, the progress was accelerated tremendously.
I can't prove to you that that's the gut microbiome, but I can look at the science, and I know that the diet is changing the gut microbiome, and I know that when that happens, positive messages are being sent up to the brain. So I absolutely feel that that is the reason why these kids, why these adults are getting an improvement. Now, sometimes it's not enough. So you have to do other things as well. But my clinical observations by doing this fits with some very current modern science. You know, in February 2017, we had one of the most significant trials of recent times in relation to this, which is called the SMILES trial. It was done in Australia. I think it was only 67 people. Okay, it's a small trial, but it was a randomized controlled trial. So that gold standard trial that we use as doctors when we assess the benefit of pharmaceutical drugs was being applied to a dietary intervention. So you had these patients with moderate to severe depression. They'd already been diagnosed. Okay, they've got a mental health problem. They were already on treatment, some form of treatment. Okay, we didn't change that treatment. One group was put on a modified Mediterranean diet. Okay, one group was not, and they had some social support. Okay, the modified Mediterranean diet consisted of all kinds of things, including lots of omega-3 rich fatty fish, lots of colorful fruit and vegetables. There were also some whole grains in this diet. I think they were like the real when we talk about whole grains, a lot of the whole grains that people buy in the West are not really whole grains. They're very refined and processed. But we don't need to necessarily go into the specifics. The point is they were put on a modified Mediterranean diet for 12 weeks. And there was a statistically significant remission rate in the group who went on the modified Mediterranean diet. Absolutely incredible. This was a randomized controlled trial. And I recently spoke to Professor John Crine, who's one of the lead world researchers in gut health and the brain out of Cork in Ireland. Absolutely incredible. And he's now working with that team to look at, are these benefits mediated through the microbiome? Absolutely incredible. Professor John Quine has done lots of research in this area. He's done a trial where people, I think it was people who've got, they were exposed to a stressful situation. Very standard stressful situation that is considered in laboratory testing to impose high levels of stress on the body. And one group were given a specific bacterium in the form of a probiotic capsule. I think it was Bifidobacterium longum, 22, but certainly a specific type of probiotic bacteria. And the group who got it, their stress resilience improved. The amount that their stress hormones went up in response to the stressor was reduced simply by taking a probiotic capsule. Now, to take a balanced viewpoint here, some of the trials with certain probiotic capsules don't show that. So he's trying to figure out which ones do and which ones don't. And I think we also need to recognize that we are still early in the science on the gut microbiome. So we don't quite know yet which probiotics, which particular bacteria, are going to help in what conditions, okay? But what do I say? I say, generally speaking, we regard probiotics as do no harm. Ultimately, very few of us as doctors who are using them think that if we get the wrong one, we don't think we're going to do any harm. And I feel very comfortable with that. But we don't have to take a probiotic. The most powerful way to change our gut microbiome is by changing what we eat, okay? And there's no risk there. So we can look at the science and see what the science is telling us, that the gut microbiome is critical for many different conditions. And we also know that your diet is the simplest and quickest way to change that.
Hippocrates said all diseases start in the gut. There could actually be some truth to that many chronic diseases start in the gut. It's kind of a rediscovering of ancient truths about that. Not ancient, but older truth about a high fiber diet is good for most people. But now we know why, not because of the bulk forming of the water retention in your gut, or better bowel movements. It's because you feed your microbes the ultimate food, and they thrive and increase their diversity.
You're doing some fascinating work here, you and your team, and you've been uncovering some really interesting things. Can you talk about some of the kind of recent developments and what you've been discovering about the microbiome?
Yeah, we're interested in the gut-brain connection, so how events in the gut, specifically microbial events, affect everything from mood and emotion to neurodegeneration. And so trying to understand whether or not there are specific bacteria that either promote or protect against diseases such as autism or Parkinson's disease. So the nerves in the gut communicate with the brain through the vagus nerve directly in terms of neuronal connections, but also through soluble molecules that are secreted in the gut that may activate the enteric nervous system as well as the central nervous system. And we and others are trying to understand what is the basis of that communication. How do microbes or molecules mediate this interaction between the gut and the brain?
There's a connection, there's a Bluetooth that is working between your brain and your gut. So if I give you an apple right now, that apple, when you look at that apple, the apple is very distinguished from you as a person. There's the entity of an apple and there's you. Until you look at the apple and your brain registers that it's hungry and needs glucose. Now the whole relationship with you and the apple changes. Because your body starts to look at the apple and now you start salivating. You start preparing your whole gastrointestinal system for that apple to do what it's meant to do, to be converted from glucose into fuel, to be broken down into its nutrient forms, and eventually to be then eliminated. And so that happens with your eyesight. That happens when you look at the apple. And so this Bluetooth that I talk about is how your brain is intrinsically connected to your gut. There's this connection there that without which we wouldn't be here, right? Without which this whole thing of digestion, elimination would not happen. And so because of that, we are very susceptible to information that's coming from everywhere. The same way that you're susceptible to, not susceptible, but your body has to look at that apple and convert it into fuel. Other variables may happen that will stop that conversion from being fully optimized. So the environmental, social influences external to us very directly affect our relationship with what needs to come into our bodies.
But so I was a young girl dying of heart failure, and it was because of an eating disorder. And we now know that the role that the microbiome plays with not only physical illness, but also emotional, and the fact that you can't really separate the two. Eating disorders, many heart conditions, all have to do with not just the microbiome, but the role of the microbiome in what we call the connectome, how all of our nerve cells, our brain, the 100 million in our brain, the 100 million in our gut, and the 40,000 in our heart, how through the microbiota and these bacteria in our skin, in our mouth, in our vaginal cavity, how they all work together to really talk. And in an eating disorder, you're not nourishing your body properly, of course. And so there is a lot of dysbiosis and disbalance between your connectome, your nervous system, all the microbiota of your whole organism, and also how that affects your emotions.
The brain is actually connected all throughout the gut. Those tissues are connected. And what they found is that there's information that goes back between the gut and the brain, either serotonin and neurotransmitters or peptides and other things through signaling agents back and forth. So there's those types of connections. So those are called canalized pathways. Then there are called non-canalized pathways, which isn't due to strict hardcore anatomy, that the gut itself releases neuropeptides and different polysaccharides and different cytokines that can cross the blood-brain barrier and have their effect on the brain too.
Dr. Gershon wrote the book, The Second Brain, where he said, actually, there's more communications going from our gut to our brain than the other way around. And what are those communications saying? Well, those bacteria, they're making neurotransmitters. My God. They're making GABA, they're making serotonin, and they're sending those neurotransmitters to our brain. There's more neurotransmitters coming from our gut than we make in our brain. Is that not the personality? Does that not imply that maybe we should be dealing with the personality of a person's gut when they've got a chronic illness? Just a thought.
So after this experience with my healing from the heart failure, I lived a very healthy lifestyle, but then it was in my mid-20s that I found myself in a very high-stress job and had fallen away from eating really well, was kind of using coffee to keep me awake and alert all the time, and eating more junk food than I had used to because I was so busy. And I started to have some health problems, digestive, and a lot of body pains. It was later diagnosed as chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. So this was prior to understanding the philosophy of naturopathic medicine. I had gone to many different physicians, and a lot of them just said that it was all in my head, right? So for pain or headaches, they just wanted to give me an antidepressant. And at one time I said to a neurologist, I said, I don't want to take these medications. And so then he wanted me to go see a psychiatrist, right? Because this crazy girl doesn't want to take our medication. So that's when I went on a kind of a second research, self-research, and found a naturopathic medical clinic. And the very first thing that she told me was, your headaches and your pains all have to do with your gut. Well, in something like anorexia nervosa or bulimia, when you have just a complete lack of the proper nutrition, your body isn't producing enough. You don't have it's just really trying to keep you alive, right? So it's not able to do all those extra things like grow shiny hair and keep your neurotransmitters in balance. It's just trying to keep your heart pumping and keep the blood flowing through your body. And so it was this feeling of never feeling really in my body. And I've counseled girls through this, and I think that there's like this dissociation, this dissociative state that happens because all of those chemicals that mediate our consciousness and our physical selves are off balance.
Everyone has a unique microbiome. And so the details of how the microbiome interacts with the food that you're consuming and its effects on that individual have to do with the specific microbes and the specific activities that they carry out in that individual. And so the big question is, that's great information, and that really does influence the differences among individuals in how food and other factors influence their health. But how do we know that these individuals will react in a certain way? How do we know what their microbiome looks like? And so that's been a huge advance in the last 10 to 15 years or so. Technology has been developed in research laboratories to begin to use DNA testing to identify specific microbes. And that's gotten better and better over time, so that in the last few years, we can identify even down to the strain level exactly which kinds of microbes are in your particular microbiome. And based on that information and a wide range of rapidly growing research, we're starting to learn what these individual microbes are doing, which ones seem to break down fibers and which types of fibers, which ones actually can break down certain types of drugs, which ones can break down protein components, and then what products do they produce under certain conditions. So we can start to basically look at these patterns and make predictions and gain some insight not only into what sort of diet someone is eating. So it's a little bit of a check sometimes when someone says, oh, I've been eating a lot of fiber, and then we look at the microbiome and it doesn't really look like they've been eating as much as they think they're eating. So that's a good point for us to basically look at the microbiome, see that it doesn't look like they have very high levels of these fiber-degrading microbes, and we can suggest that they should consider eating more fiber. It can get very detailed at that point. We know, for example, that a particular type of product that's produced by the microbiome from fiber, called butyrate, and many, many research studies have shown that this product called butyrate actually is very good for immune health, for intestinal health, and even for brain health. So the question is, if we look at your microbiome and it looks like your butyrate-producing bacteria are low, and that's consistent with the symptoms that we're assessing and that you're potentially displaying, we can potentially recommend, in those cases, certain specific foods and supplements that have been shown in research to increase butyrate production. And then that has health benefits for that individual.
So there's an intimate bidirectional relationship between these two things, and brain health is important for gut function, and gut function is really important for brain health.
Our own genome isn't sufficient to induce or to promote all the different functions or activities of the human body, that we rely on inputs or signals from the microbiome. And it's really fascinating to see how bacteria in our gut provide signals or cues to our development and function, just as our own genome does. And many people have suggested, and I do agree, that we have two genomes, our own and a microbial genome.
And that raises the whole question about the microbiome. We've got 30 trillion bacteria in there. Do we not think they're talking to each other? Do we not think they're communicating with each other?
We've always known that the vagus nerve travels down to the gut and internal organs, but we had no idea how much of a two-way street it is. We're now learning about the massive amount of transference of information and even infection back up towards the brain. The gut and the brain have a direct connection, and we're about to follow up with how the microbiome directly influences diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. But first, let's review some of the key concepts on the gut-brain connection. The vagus nerve is the main connector of the gut and the brain, and it's a cranial nerve that has direct access to the internal organs. Interoception is the body's ability to sense things at an organ level, and we're just learning about this two-way communication pathway. Gut bacteria produce GABA and serotonin, two major neurotransmitters for mood and anxiety. We're finding certain bacteria in the gut that lead to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's years later. Butyrate is an anti-inflammatory byproduct produced by healthy bacteria in our guts. Now, before you run off to buy some, the real answer is to feed the bacteria to support its production. Okay, back to the episode in just a second. I sincerely hope you're enjoying these amazing insights into the microbiome. And right now, I wanted to take a moment to share how you can watch and rewatch these episodes at your leisure when you take the opportunity to purchase the complete Interconnected documentary series. Click on the link below this video to get all the details and how to access some amazing bonuses that help you put into practice the healing power of the microbiome. Better still, the proceeds from your investment will help us continue our journey into the future of microbiome-based medicine. So please click the link below and check out our limited time discount offer. It's only available while these episodes are live. Come back in a few days and it's too late, so don't risk it. Grab your copy of Interconnected, The Power to Heal from Within, and join me on this adventure into the healing mysteries of the microbiome. We're living at an interesting time in history where life expectancy is much higher, and so's the rise of degenerative brain disease like Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's. Some argue that these are natural processes that come with longer life, but now there's evidence that they're directly tied to diet and the microbiome. Recent discoveries about certain gut bacteria have shed more light on this subject, and it's nothing less than revolutionary.
Dementia is horrible. I wouldn't, wish it on my worst enemy. It's really difficult for the patient. It's just as difficult, if not more so, for the family. They say that people with Alzheimer's disease die twice because, on the one hand, they lose touch with who they are, with who their loved ones are, and then, nobody has ever recovered from Alzheimer's disease. So, it's a horrific condition, and it's just one form of dementia. So, my mom has a very rare form of dementia that make up 1% of dementia cases. And so there is next to no research on the role of diet and lifestyle in what my mom has. So to a certain degree, I'm grasping at straws because what I have to go on really is Alzheimer's disease research. It's the most common form of dementia. So it's where all the money goes. And then Parkinson's disease is the second most common form of a neurodegenerative disease. And so really, I've had to connect the dots and put two and two together and really just take a kitchen sink approach with my mom. But at the end of the day, I'm not delusional. These conditions begin way earlier than the presentation of symptoms. I'm under, no illusion that my mom is going to reverse her disease at this stage in its progression. So for me, whenever I'm around her, I just try to be as loving of a son as I can. I try to teach gently. To me, I really want to get this information out to young people. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Genius Foods. Genius Foods is, written in the language of performance because that's what young people are into. So I wrote it really to be the ultimate Trojan horse so that a new generation is going to tune into this content and realize the role of gut health in brain health and unwittingly perhaps end up preventing their own dementia.
We talk about Parkinson's, we talk about Alzheimer's, we talk about some of these really advanced neurodegenerative issues. And, most people, may know somebody that has something like that, but they're like, okay, I'm fine, that's not me. Let's talk about diminished output to the brain. Let's talk about the bad decisions and the brain fog and all the things that come from not having access to your brain for decades before this thing becomes a tremor or, memory loss.
Yeah. Today, 1 in 7 younger people complain of memory problems. 1 in 6 adults is on or has used some kind of psychiatric medication. If you make it to the age of 85, you have a 50% chance of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. These statistics are staggering, and yet, for the vast majority of us, if we really want to look into the crystal ball of the future and know our odds for developing Alzheimer's disease, it's a coin toss.
So I was working in corporate America in a computer job and had, prior to that, been a very adventurous person. But as a result of working in this corporate America job, working really long hours, getting really stressed, I started to get anxious. And this happened in my late 30s. At the same time this was happening, I was having major cognitive issues. I was working in a computer job, and there was a lot of importance on accuracy and everything being 100% perfect, and I was finding that I couldn't think anymore, I couldn't focus. So I went to the doctor and I said, I can't think, and something's going on, and I've got this anxiety, and he said, okay, let's do a brain scan. Let's just rule out everything and let's do a brain scan. So he did a CT scan, nothing showed up, which was great.
I started really to look at every aspect of the modern food environment and our lifestyles, leaving no stone unturned. And, you know, many signs inevitably pointed me to the gut and the role of gut health in the overall health of your body, but particularly the brain. The gut-brain axis is this really exciting area of science, and there are many question marks that still remain. But nonetheless, there is this link emerging in the literature that to me is incredibly compelling. And even though we're just at the very tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding the full relationship between the gut and the brain, I think, and the best available evidence to me suggests that we have enough information at this time that we don't need to sit idly on our hands as we await whatever is in our sort of genetic hand of cards.
By 1996, we had gone to genetically modifying corn, soybean, and the sugar beet ultimately. Corn, soybean, sugar beet are our staple crops that cover some 80% of our farm fields throughout the United States. Those staple crops through all history produced essential amino acids. If you spray crops with glyphosate, or the soil that they grow in, it turns out glyphosate blocks the ability of the essential amino acids to be made. Some specific ones: tyrosine, tryptophan, phenylalanine, 5-HTP, and a couple others. But let's take those first three: tyrosine, tryptophan, phenylalanine. These are the building blocks for all of the neurotransmitters that dominate your brain. We took the building blocks for your neurotransmitters out of the diet through spraying our crops directly with a chemical called glyphosate. What would we expect to emerge? Well, we should see a lot of neurologic dysfunction. It turns out that the biggest neurologic system that would touch that is your gut itself. The gut's got as many neurons in your gut than most pets have in their entire brain. Huge amount of neural density here that's now being exposed to an environment where there's perhaps some direct toxicity of that chemical glyphosate, but more importantly, you're deleting the neurotransmitter from your gut. So what's going to happen? You're going to get bloating after meals. You're going to have screw up the peristalsis and movement of material through the gut. So you're going to get heartburn, bloating, irritable bowel syndrome stuff where you're kind of shifting from diarrhea to constipation, back and forth. You can't have regular bowel movements.
Upwards of 80% of people with Parkinson's have constipation. And in almost all cases, the constipation precedes their motor symptoms. So Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative condition. The main symptom are tremors or motor dysfunction. It is also associated with depression and other cognitive defects as well, but it's diagnosed based on its motor defects. And so again, we were really intrigued why this classical neurological condition has such a strong GI component, has a strong gut component to it, and tested whether or not microbes in a mouse model of Parkinson's affected various outcomes associated with the disease. And what we showed is that we can remove the gut bacteria from mice that are prone to develop Parkinson's, and all of their motor symptoms go away. And in fact, the main pathology, the main disturbance in their brain, which is aggregation of a protein called alpha-synuclein, also disappears when you remove the microbiome from mice that were prone to develop Parkinson's. And so this gave us some insight into thinking that there are signals sent between the gut and the brain that promotes and perhaps even alleviate symptoms of Parkinson's. So we set out to identify what those molecules were, and identified a class of molecules called short-chain fatty acids, which are known to activate the immune system, but what we discovered is that they activate the immune system in a way that then leads to the exacerbation of disease.
So there's now very good evidence to suggest that that Parkinson's disease has two entry ports, one through the gastrointestinal tract, one through the olfactory system, and that if you look at these entry ports, a long time before the full-blown Parkinson's syndrome develops, that you can see these classical degenerations, these Lewy bodies that are pathognomonic for Parkinson's disease in the nervous system of the gut. We don't know exactly how they get there, but one possibility is that there's these transducing cells in our gut that also contain serotonin, and that either viruses or prions or some other microorganism gets access to the enteric nervous system, infects that area, and then propagates itself up the spinal cord, through the brainstem, ultimately into the dopaminergic systems within the brain. This has huge implications because those early changes happen up to 25 years before the full-blown neurological syndrome develops. And so diagnostically, if you can make that diagnosis in a patient that comes to you with a new onset constipation, you have 25 years to do an intervention. So we don't know yet what this intervention would be. Certainly, I would put them on a high-fiber diet, but I'm sure in the future we'll have other types of interventions that will basically prevent the development. And I think that will happen in the next 5 years. I think a lot of companies are working in this space, and there may be other neurodegenerative diseases where that's a similar type of mechanism occurs.
What's the link between the microbiome and this gut-brain axis?
The microbiome is this universe of microorganisms, essentially, that take up residence in our large intestine, otherwise known as the colon. And we basically carry around with us just as many bacterial cells as we do human cells. So we're about 50% bacteria. And these organisms that live within us influence our health in a myriad of ways. I mean, for one, they serve as the sort of boot camp for our body's immune systems. This is incredibly important because we see rates of autoimmunity on the rise today, and Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease have an inflammatory component. So they're characterized by essentially an immune system that's gone haywire, particularly in the later stages of the disease. So in the sense that this microbial universe can sort of modulate our body's immune systems and inflammatory responses, I think that's incredibly compelling. The other way that the microbiome influences our brain function and ultimately our brain health is by way of the myriad of chemicals and vitamins that they churn out when we feed them appropriately, that they then release into our bloodstream. So we essentially have this drug factory. I mean, people today are interested in smart drugs and nootropics and things like that, right? We basically have that in our large intestine working for us. All we got to do is feed them the right foods.
I was suddenly exposed to the possibility that there was something biochemical going on that was triggering both this brain fog and the anxiety, and that there was something that I could do. And the first thing that we looked at was digestion and my gut. And once we started to do that, I started to connect the dots that I had gluten issues, I had really bad enzyme status, so I wasn't digesting the food that I was eating. I was eating pretty healthy at the time. And I discovered other food sensitivities. So my whole life, I had this underlying issue with my gut, and I think it was a combination of the going through hormonal changes in perimenopause. It was a combination of the stress and the past underlying gut issues that I had that brought everything to the surface and caused this anxiety, this panic attacks.
So one of the things that we're actually seeing right now with bacterial overgrowth is that when the intestine is inflamed, it can actually irritate an immune cell called a mast cell. And that mast cell has a direct link to the nervous system. And so all these people that I treat that actually have significant bloating, abdominal discomfort, bacterial overgrowth, they'll describe having a brain fog. They'll have fatigue. Sometimes their anxiety gets worse. And now we realize it's probably due to this mast cell stimulating a nerve, dumping its contents, histamine and tryptase, and then there's inflammation being caused in the brain. That's our brain-gut connection. Now, we do see that this histamine sensitivity can be just histamine sensitivity. It can be mast cell activation syndrome, MCAS, and then it could be actually go so far as to become a cancer called mastocytosis. So this is something that we really need to start paying some attention to. Why are some of these people having all these mast cell issues? And that's kind of next level of what we're working on.
To me, it's just fascinating that some of these horrific diseases might actually begin well below the neck and in fact in the gut. I mean, our minds produce who we are in the same way that a joint produces movement. So we've got to take care of our brains. I mean, we can't exactly look in the mirror and flex our hippocampi the way that we can, our biceps, for example. But by exercising more, by eating a healthier diet, I mean, it's essentially giving our brains a workout.
Once I started to make these changes, dietary changes, looking at the gut, looking at nutritional deficiencies, the results were pretty profound. Not everything was perfect, but I started to feel better right away. The microbiome and figuring out what was going on in my digestion was key to my recovery, and I consider it to be key to my resilience and health going forwards, whatever comes my way. If it's a stressful situation, if I'm exposed to some other kind of parasite, if I'm under a lot of stress and I'm losing nutrients because of what's going on in my gut. So to me, I think the microbiome is central, and I'm just so excited to see all the research that's coming out about how important gut health and our microbiome is.
Is there anything that we've learned to date that can be, dietary or supplementally driven that can help move this along, or is it still too early?
Microbes eat what we give them. In other words, whatever foods we eat, microbes begin to digest, begin to break down metabolically before we do. In fact, the vast majority of the nutrients that we absorb are breakdown products from microbes. So diet is an important factor in all microbiome biology, research, or the effects in the clinic. And what many people are now doing is trying to understand, what is that diet microbiome relationship? In other words, in the presence of certain organisms, are there specific diets that may feed the quote-unquote beneficial organisms and cause them to bloom? Are there diets that may reduce the expansion of harmful organisms as a therapeutic intervention? And so, of course, diet and microbiome are intimately intertwined, but we still, as of this point, don't have specific diets for various different indications, various different diseases. But again, trying to understand how microbes metabolize the foods that we ingest will lead to an understanding of how those byproducts, those metabolites, affect neurological conditions.
There was this really incredible research performed fairly recently where they found in a large population patients that underwent a procedure called a vagotomy, where they basically had their vagus nerve severed, which connects the brain to the gut, liver, gallbladder, and other organs. They found that people who had that procedure had a 50% risk reduction for developing Parkinson's disease. They've shown us that microbes in the gut can actually influence, by way of the vagus nerve, the susceptibility of proteins in the brain to cross-link and clump together. So Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, these conditions are characterized by the clumping of these proteins in the brain. So the notion that Parkinson's disease might begin in the gut and make its way up to the brain by way of the vagus nerve, to me, is fascinating, and actually one of the earliest and most frequently overlooked symptoms of Parkinson's disease begins in the gut. It's constipation. By the time you show your very first symptom of Parkinson's disease, half of the dopaminergic neurons involved in movement in the part of the brain affected by Parkinson's disease are already dead. And we can't regrow those neurons once they're gone. So none of these diseases, like any chronic disease, begin overnight. They all bubble up in the body over years, if not decades, before the presentation of symptoms.
The microbes in and on us participate in a variety of chemical pathways in our bodies. And when I say chemical pathways, I mean the series of events that leads to the production of, say, serotonin. So we need serotonin in order to regulate our appetite and to regulate our sleeping and to keep our mood up, right? Serotonin, people who have low serotonin are thought to suffer from depression. There's a connection, a relationship between lack of serotonin and moodiness or sadness or depression. Serotonin is produced by cells in your gut. Most of it is produced by cells in your gut. But those cells can't produce serotonin in adequate amounts unless there are certain microbes present who essentially poop molecular byproducts that the cell needs to construct the serotonin. And who knows how many, I mean, who knows? One can find out, and there's plenty of scientists who are trying to study this, or trying to figure out which microbes are contributing which part to create these essential compounds that help make us survive the day.
So you had these patients with moderate to severe depression. They'd already been diagnosed, okay? They've got a mental health problem. They were already on treatment, some form of treatment, okay? We didn't change that treatment. One group was put on a modified Mediterranean diet, okay? One group was not, and they had some social support, okay? The modified Mediterranean diet consisted of all kinds of things, including lots of omega-3 rich fatty fish, lots of colorful fruit and vegetables. The point is they were put on a modified Mediterranean diet for 12 weeks, and there was a statistically significant remission rate in the group who went on the modified Mediterranean diet. Absolutely incredible. This was a randomized controlled trial. The most powerful way to change our gut microbiome is by changing what we eat.
And I have a lot of patients that have mood issues, a little anxiety, depression. And I use a similar approach no matter what those issues are of the list I gave you. So it's making sure that the gut is healthy. I want to make sure that they're not eating foods. I mean, people eat 3 times a day. I have to make sure that the foods they eat don't cause inflammation.
The consistency of the stools is screwed up. And then you start to get, real inflammatory changes in the gut lining. You can get colitis, you can get all, Crohn's disease, all these things kind of emerging as you're screwing up this whole neurologic system. But since 90% of the serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter in your brain and central nervous system, is made in the gut lining, and it's made from, serotonin and dopamine being the 2 of the big ones, made from these essential amino acids that are being deleted by the Roundup era, you suddenly have a brain that doesn't have the fuel, and so you have a huge epidemic of major depression. We've hit 1 in 2 adults with major depression as a lifetime prevalence now. 1 in 2 adults in the United States will have major depression, 1 in 3 will have a generalized anxiety disorder. And these will be severe enough, those 1 in 2, 1 in 3 will be severe enough that they show up at a physician's office and need drug management. And so the numbers may be way higher than that of more mild forms of major depression and anxiety disorder. And so neuro building blocks, the building blocks for the way in which the neurologic system have been deleted out of our food chain, deleted out of our soils, deleted out of our gut environment, and we suffer a paucity. So now we're dependent on pharmaceutical drugs that block the reuptake of these chemicals to try to artificially increase in a synapse the amount of serotonin and dopamine present because they're running on fumes. Your brain and your gut are literally running on fumes because you're lacking those essential Legos or amino acids that would build those big neurotransmitters.
So doing your best to eat organically, not be exposed to complex food chemicals that usually come in processed food, stay away from areas that have just been sprayed with pesticides, and then also do a detoxification protocol. And many of the supplement companies and functional medicine practitioners know how to enhance detoxification. So do a 28-day detoxification so you get the toxins out of your system as well as decreasing exposure. And that's a great thing to do.
The function of your microbiome, first and foremost, is to keep you safe from disease. It's to make sure that your immunity is at its highest level. It's to make sure that your metabolism is optimized to the nth degree. So when this microbiome is affected, your immunity is decreased. And so my job becomes to tell my patients, to help them realize that whatever they're doing in their lives, whatever the script is, needs to change. And we carry scripts all the time. I have to work more, I have to make more money, I have to pay my mortgage, I have to look good. among my family members and friends. We are competitors. We compete a lot with one another. Facebook and other social media is always comparing us to other people. So I think we are in this culture of more is better. And the more that we try to make that true, the less we're paying attention to the damages that it's happening in our body. It's through the microbiome.
What we recently considered natural aging has now flipped on its head. Recent developments in neurology have shown that neurons in the brain can regenerate. This has set half the medical world on fire. Now we're hearing that bacteria in the gut are responsible for many degenerative conditions that can be detected and prevented years in advance. This is huge, and it's about to revolutionize healthcare. We've also learned here that perhaps there's a smoking gun in the sharp increase of these diseases that has to do with the chemicals and pesticides being applied to our food. Let's recap. These are a few essential amino acids taken out of the food supply chain by glyphosate or Roundup. They're tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine. These would lead to serotonin and dopamine production, and since they're missing from most of our food, is it any wonder why everyone's depressed? 90% of our serotonin is made in the gut lining, and this is the neurotransmitter most of the antidepressants try to squeeze and recirculate. The real answer is to heal the gut, eat non-GMO foods, and turn the factory back on. 1 in 2 adults in the United States will have major depression, and 1 in 3 will have generalized anxiety disorder. We're now realizing how an unhealthy gut and microbiome are key players in this. It's bad enough what's happening to the aging brain, but what about when we see issues in our children with developing brains? In my experience, that's when people get really concerned and are willing to step up. ADD and autism are on the rise, and the kids are spinning out of control. Drugs are being thrown at the problem with very little success, and we're now beginning to understand the core issue, one of toxicity, nutrient deficiency, and a lack of microbial diversity. Let's look at how this is impacting our kids.
In 1975, we had a rate of autism of 1 in 5,000 children. When I grew up, I had never heard of autism. There were certainly no kids in any of my schools that had autism. And, I was just a normal kid, grew up. Now you go to a school and we're at 1 in 36 children with autism. 1 in 8 has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder diagnosed and treated with a stimulant drug like Ritalin or Adderall, which is speed. And so in a single kindergarten class, you see this huge neurologic stress. Our trajectory from 1 in 5,000 children in 1975 to 1 in 36 today accelerated the fastest since 2012. We were on a pretty steep climb, and then it went vertical in the last 6 years. At our current rate, we're going to hit 1 in 3 children with autism by 2035.
Let's talk about what you would do for that kid, and then what looking down the barrel of a life of starting with Ritalin and Adderall might do to their long-term health, thinking it's some innocuous thing that'll help them sit in school.
I think functional medicine, integrative medicine, has a great approach. We have a great track record with treating autism, ADHD, ADD. Again, in this population, we see disturbance in the microbiome. We often see food addiction, food allergy, food sensitivity. Micronutrient deficiencies are really common. Sometimes the energy centers in mitochondria, we see imbalances there, and so we need to shore up nutrients. We might see increased oxidative stress, free radical activity, which fundamentally can break down key proteins. There can be a little bit of imbalance in the neurotransmitters in the brain. In fact, there is. That's the pathogenic, one of the fundamental pathogenic mechanism of some of these conditions. But the cause of those, we need to zoom way out, and it tends to be, micronutrient deficiencies, microbiome disruption, food reactions, and so forth. So we can do some pretty fundamental treatments and turn them around.
Picture that now. 1 in 3 children with a neurologic condition that keeps them from being able to participate in what we would kind of consider a normal economic productivity state. They can't participate in a normal classroom. They can't participate in a normal business environment. They're not going to be able to be productive in the current environment that we have. And it takes two people to be productive enough to supply the resources needed to support one autistic child. And so if it takes two to support one, and 1 in 3 have the condition, you're going to wipe out an entire generation who has to be productive enough just to handle autism alone as if that was the only disease process.
Our entire naming system in medicine is based on symptoms and geography. What are the symptoms and where is it? Do you have stomach pain? Do you have head pain? What is it? And then we categorize people according to these symptoms and geography and not according to the causes or the mechanisms. So you can have one cause that can cause dozens of diseases. You can have one disease that's caused by dozens of causes. So just because you know the name of the disease doesn't mean you know what's wrong with you, right? If you say you have depression, it's a common name we give to people who are sad and hopeless and helpless and have no interest in sex and can't sleep and have no appetite and feel suicidal. But we say you have depression. Depression isn't the cause of the symptoms, it's the name of the symptoms.
There is a clear understanding that the gut and the brain crosstalk all the time. And this was known to us for a long time. We know that the brain can communicate with the gut. That's the reason why we are nervous or we're stressed. We have stomachache and, issue with the gut. What we didn't know is that the gut can talk with the brain as well. And in doing so can change our behavior. And on a specific genetic background, the outcome can be whatever, including autism, of course. There is nothing else that a neuroinflammatory process that can materialize because of dysbiosis, create an instigation to the immune system to fight. And these immune cells, they are sitting on the battlefields. They can leave the battlefields, go into the brain, and create the condition of neuroinflammation.
The causes could be many. It could be that you've taken antibiotics and altered your gut flora, and you have dysbiosis that's leading to inflammation in the brain. It could be you've got a low thyroid, or you're eating gluten that's triggering neuroinflammation. It could be that you have taken acid blockers for years and don't absorb B12 because of it and have B12 deficiency, or you have vitamin D deficiency, or maybe it's because you eat a lot of sushi and have mercury poisoning, or maybe because you hate fish and have omega-3 deficiency, or eat a lot of sugar and have prediabetes in your brain, all of which cause depression. Our current model of thinking in diagnosis will not help you navigate to the causes. So that's what functional medicine does. It's a new roadmap, a new GPS system for thinking about disease. And by addressing all those variables, we can often treat the same conditions by using the same approach. Doesn't mean every case of Alzheimer's or autism is caused by the gut or obesity or diabetes. But by looking at everybody as an individual, you can identify which patients that might be the case, and then you can treat them.
We need to look for toxins. These kids can be either overexposed to toxins, overexposed at a young life. I mean, we see autism. There's a higher incidence of autism in individuals who are near, say, coal-fired plants or, mercury exposure of any kind. We can see increased incidence. So if they're exposed to environmental toxins, we need to get those out. Or conversely, if they're sensitive because their genes dictate they just can't get them out, we still need to look and support them in removal. So toxins play a role here too, for sure. Organotoxins, things like pesticides in food, preservatives, additives of any kind. These kids on the spectrum can be highly sensitive to. So a careful investigation needs to be made, and these corrections need to happen, and they can get on with their lives in a really beautiful and empowering way.
Clearly, again, it's the environment that we're changing that is creating the story. And there are evidence now that the microbiome is highly modified in kids with autism compared to kids that are not autistic. And another, factor that seems to suggest the microbiome has a great deal to do with this is the fact that, kids with autism, very often they have GI, conditions or symptoms that are associated with autism. Once again, you look at the composition, the microbiome is different, and you can wonder now, is the cause or the consequence of the disease? And we recently did a study in which we did fecal transplant in the autistic kids, showing not only improvement in their GI symptoms, but also their behavior. Again, I'm not advocating that fecal transplant it would be the solution to autism, but at least it's proving that that's a fair target. So I really do believe that, that would be one area in which we can really make a tremendous difference. And you know, some of the people here in the center have totally focused on this gut-brain axis crosstalk and how we can change this by manipulating the microbiome, targeting mainly autism in kids and schizophrenia in adults.
Dr. Jim Adams from ASU and his crew, Kang, Rosa, the rest of the team there, have been looking at the lack of organisms in children with autism. It's been fascinating. They did a trial back in 2015 where they looked at the amount of organisms in the average person, and then they compared the autism children, and they found about a 25% decrease. So what they did was they took 18 children on the autism spectrum, and 6 of them, they gave rectal fecal microbial transplantation. Okay, this was a purified, microbe-only addition to their rectum. And then they followed them for 8 weeks. And guess what? Absolutely, it improved significantly. And along with those symptoms of constipation, diarrhea, intestinal upset, whatnot, you also saw the symptoms decrease. So there's a 2-year follow-up paper that hasn't been published totally yet, but behind the scenes, what we're hearing is it seems incredibly positive that now we might be able to improve autism by improving intestinal microbiome status. So it's as if nature is intending us every step of the way to survive in this microbial soup. They're here first. We evolved in their presence. So these are adaptive mechanisms so we can thrive in their presence, with them in us, on us, everywhere. So when we look at the diet and we say, oh, everybody should be doing a low FODMAP diet, everybody should be doing a specific carbohydrate diet, a GAPS diet or whatnot, you say, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. If we're taking away the foods of the organisms, and the organisms, we're hosts to the organisms, they control most of us, why would we want to do that? I mean, temporarily you can calm down overgrowth, yes, absolutely, but is that something we want to do long term? It doesn't make sense. So for example, autism, right? The SCD diet, the GAPS diet, very effective in autistic children. Why? Well, it's a lower starch diet. Well, it turns out that the autistic kids are missing a lot of the specific organisms called Prevotella that help them digest starch, right? So Jim Adams showed, 25% less organisms in general in autistic kids, okay? So holy smokes, you gotta think, all right, is the problem then the starch, or is the problem the missing microbes? If we could give the microbes back to the kids via fecal microbial transplantation or eventually specific probiotics for autism, would we then negate the need for the specific carbohydrate diet? Does that make sense?
So we started working on autism about 7 or 8 years ago, and we were driven to test the role of the microbiome in autism by a couple of factors. First, that many children with autism have gastrointestinal issues. It's generally overlooked by the medical community or by doctors, but parents will tell you that their children will have constipation, bloating, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, alternating constipation and diarrhea. Somewhere along the lines of 50% of children with autism will have gastrointestinal symptoms, and this was intriguing to us because we're thinking about the bacteria that live in the gut and whether or not there's a connection between the gut and the brain. The other aspect that made us think that there might be a role for microbes in autism is the increase or the reported increase in the diagnoses of autism, as that there's a very rapid increase in the number of cases of autism in developed Western countries. And so that suggested that there's a role for environment, that changes in the environment may be mediating this rapid increase because our genetics likely didn't change that dramatically in a couple of generations. Now, of course, there's a very important genetic component to autism, and many people are researching that.
So it's the same thing with the FODMAPs, you know? Maybe you're having FODMAP intolerance because you don't have the organisms to properly digest the FODMAPs. So does that mean you remove more FODMAPs and cause a further issue? No, I think the people who had found FODMAP diets would agree that it's a temporary fix, and then you add them back in slowly so you can tolerate them.
We can modulate, either increase or decrease symptoms of autism or symptoms similar to autism in mice. And we're trying to understand what mediates that gut-brain connection. So how do microbes in the gut affect very complex behaviors which are driven by the brain? And of course, there's a lot of work that remains to be done, but we've identified several metabolites or small molecules produced by gut bacteria that we believe penetrate into the brain, affect the activity of neurons in the brain, and then mediate behavioral outcomes. And so we're trying to understand the basic biology of that in an effort to understand how environment contributes to autism.
Is there a particular kind of subset of bacteria that kind of take over and kind of become dominant that have these metabolites that we see in autistic kids versus a healthy, more diverse bacterial colony?
We've shown that there's a change in the metabolome or the global profile of metabolites in animals where the microbiome has been shifted in a way that affects behavior. There's human studies showing the same thing, that if you look in urine or serum of children with autism, that their metabolomes are different. But we don't know exactly what organisms or what biochemical pathways are dysregulated. Again, we have our hands on some metabolites. We believe that those metabolites have the ability to modulate behavior, but exactly where they're coming from, in other words, which microbes are coming from, still remains largely unknown. And even more fundamental is what caused that change in the microbiome in the first place.
No, the problem is we're not going to survive. We are dying. 1 in 3 males has infertility in the United States. 1 in 4 women is infertile in the United States. We keep on this trajectory, we won't be able to reproduce our species. And even when we do reproduce it, it's in a disease environment. Like I said, the C-section rate and all this disease around and everything else. We are collapsing as a species. It's not getting talked about, so where is the hope? And it turns out it's in the microbiome. The microbiome is so freaking forgiving and so passionate about life itself. It springs forth life everywhere it touches. It can make life out of nothing.
The microbiome is now believed to be our best hope for the survival of the species. It helps us offset toxicity, digest certain foods, and regulate brain function. We see common disturbances in the microbiome of children with many of these modern problems, and ongoing research hopes to find preventative and corrective measures in the gut. Of course, living next to a coal plant isn't helpful, so a winning strategy is to minimize toxin exposure while bolstering the microbiome with diet, environment, and lifestyle choices. Let's take a few moments to review some of the key takeaways. 1 in 8 kids has attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, diagnosed and treated with a stimulant, or Adderall, which is essentially giving our kids speed. In 1975, we had a rate of autism of 1 in 5,000 children. Now, we're at 1 in 36 children with autism. At our current rate, we're going to be at 1 in 3 children with autism by 2035. Picture that now, 1 in 3 children with a neurologic condition that keeps them from being able to participate in the economy. And it takes 2 people to be productive enough to supply the resources needed to support 1 autistic child. We see that there are 25% less organisms in general in autistic kids. So we now understand that autistic kids are missing a lot of the specific organisms in their guts, like one called Prevotella, which help them digest starch. This is just some of the wisdom on this subject. Our team has put together a vast array of resources for you in the Interconnected Companion Guide. It's filled with natural substances you can start healing your gut with right now. Maybe you or someone you know often feels sick, but you can't quite put your finger on the cause. So many of us have illnesses and ailments or diseases we could do nothing about unless we understand how our microbiomes affect, control, and govern our health. What if you could bring all this healing knowledge into your home and support our quest to share this information with the world? Click the button below and check out how you can get the full Interconnected documentary series, plus a collection of exclusive bonus resources that are available only to those who invest in the full set. The best part, you can get the entire package at a massive 50% discount right now, only during the live launch. You'll get lifetime access to everything you've seen in the episodes in 3 different formats: video, audio, and text transcript, And you'll also get the companion guides, the extended uncut interviews, and the How to Live Probiotically guide that helps you put it to work. And everything you learn here, you get to take into your life. We also have our holiday cooking guide included. But you can only get this set at this massive discount during the live launch. So let's put the power of the microbiome into your hands. Please order the Interconnected at-home set right now, risk-free. Okay, back to the episode. The gut-brain connection is profound, and it's real. The microbiome is the interface that's been the missing piece all along. We're just beginning to understand the fallout of the loss of many of these microbes and are seeing it in our elderly and young populations. For those in the middle, well, we're seeing all kinds of chronic disease, fatigue, brain fog, depression, and obesity. Just the normal stuff everyone's complaining about. This is a real wake-up call. In the next episode, we're going to examine the microbiome's role in thyroid disease, obesity, and diabetes. Spoiler alert, it's all interconnected. Make sure you check out the resources we've created for you and get yourself a copy of the series. This life-changing information can save your life and help your entire family. We've put together the content in video, audio, and transcripts for you, along with a number of vital resources and the director's cut of all the full-length interviews. You can't get this information anywhere else, and it took my team over a year to put all the research, wisdom, recipes, and gems together for you. Take advantage of it. I'll see you in the next episode.